The story you think you know is a lie. For over a century, the world has embraced a sanitized fairy tale, a Disney-manufactured dream of a charming boy who whisks children away to adventure and eternal youth. Peter Pan, they tell you, is magic incarnate, a symbol of childhood wonder, of refusing to surrender to the mundane realities of adulthood. They paint Neverland as paradise, a realm where imagination reigns supreme and death cannot touch the innocent. This is perhaps the most successful deception in literary history. The truth buried beneath this manufactured mythology is far more sinister, far more profound, and infinitely more disturbing than anything Walt Disney would dare to acknowledge. Peter Pan is not a savior of childhood innocence. He is the angel of death, draped in the costume of eternal youth, collecting lost souls and trapping them in a state that mimics life, but is, in essence, a form of spiritual extinction. The boy who never grows up doesn't preserve childhood. He murders it, freezing his victims in an eternal moment before they can experience the fullness of human existence. Neverland is not a playground. It is a liminal space between life and death, a purgatory disguised as paradise where children are held captive not by chains, but by the very thing they believe sets them free. J.M. Barrie did not create a children's story. He crafted a meditation on death, trauma, and the seductive appeal of choosing non-existence over the pain of living. The Lost Boys are not adventurers. They are casualties, souls harvested before they could discover who they might have become. When Barrie wrote that Peter thins out the Lost Boys when they begin to show signs of growing up, he revealed the story's true horror. Peter Pan systematically eliminates any child who threatens to escape his dominion by developing into a full human being. This is not whimsy. This is systematic spiritual murder, dressed in pixie dust and sold to generations as entertainment. The cheerful narrative you've been fed deliberately obscures the psychological landscape from which this story emerged. Victorian Britain was not a backdrop for adventure. It was a charnel house of childhood dreams, a society that consumed its young with industrial efficiency and called it progress. The Peter Pan myth was born from this darkness, not as an escape from it, but as a reflection of it. Every time you see that familiar silhouette flying across a nursery window, you are witnessing not rescue, but recruitment. Not salvation, but seduction into a fate worse than death, eternal stasis, forever frozen at the moment of greatest vulnerability. The Disney Corporation understood the commercial value of this deception. They transformed a Gothic meditation on mortality into a marketable fantasy, complete with tinkling music and rainbow-colored fairy dust. They buried the story's true meaning beneath layers of corporate sanitization, turning the angel of death into a poster boy for childhood wonder. But the original text remains, waiting in the shadows of our collective unconscious, whispering its dark truths to anyone willing to listen. Peter Pan doesn't save children from growing up. He saves them from living at all. This is the story they don't want you to know. This is the 130-year-old secret hidden in plain sight, disguised as innocent entertainment and fed to children as bedtime stories. The truth is written in the subtext, encoded in the symbolism, and reflected in the biographical shadows of its creator. J.M. Barrie didn't write fantasy. He wrote horror, and then watched as the world transformed his nightmare into a dream. Now, let us journey back to the world that created this darkness, to understand how such a story could emerge from the fog-shrouded streets of a society that had forgotten how to protect its most vulnerable members. The year was 1904, and London was drowning in its own filth. The city sprawled like a diseased organism across the Thames, its arteries clogged with the detritus of industrial ambition and human suffering. In the narrow alleys that snaked between towering tenements, the acrid smoke from countless coal fires hung like a permanent shroud, choking the life from everything it touched. This was not the romantic gaslight London of popular imagination. This was a city that consumed children with the mechanical efficiency of its own factories, grinding young lives into statistical abstractions and calling it the price of progress. The stench was inescapable. It rose from the overflowing sewers that ran beneath cobblestone streets, mixing the sour reek of human waste with the metallic tang of industrial runoff. It seeped through the walls of cramped basement apartments, where entire families huddled together for warmth, their breath visible in the perpetual damp that seemed to penetrate everything. The smell of poverty had its own signature: unwashed bodies, rotting food, the musty decay of clothing that never fully dried, all of it seasoned with the bitter smoke that poured from factory chimneys and domestic hearths alike. In the orphanages and workhouses that dotted the city like monuments to institutional cruelty, the sounds of childhood had been systematically erased. Here, in rooms where sunlight was a stranger, the faint but constant drip of cold water marked time with metronomic precision. The walls wept moisture that never evaporated, creating a perpetual dampness that seemed to seep into the bones of the children who called these places home. The silence was not peaceful. It was the silence of spirits already broken, of young voices that had learned the futility of crying out for help that would never come. These were the children who would inspire Barrie's Lost Boys, not the adventurous spirits of Disney's imagination, but the walking wounded of Victorian society's systematic neglect. They moved through their days like ghosts, their pale skin bearing the clammy touch of malnutrition and disease. When they did speak, it was in whispers, as if they understood instinctively that to draw attention was to invite punishment. Their eyes held a knowledge that no child should possess, the understanding that they were expendable, that their lives held no value beyond their capacity for labor or their potential as cautionary tales. The graveyards of London told the story that polite society refused to acknowledge. Here, among the weathered headstones and brittle autumn leaves that crushed underfoot with sounds like breaking bones, lay the evidence of childhood's true fate in this supposed golden age. Row upon row of small graves marked the resting places of children who had never seen their 10th birthday, victims of diseases that wealth could prevent, but poverty made inevitable. The mist that rolled through these places at dusk carried with it the weight of collective grief, the accumulated sorrow of mothers who had buried more children than they had raised. The Thames itself had become a repository for the city's darkest secrets. Ancient wooden ships groaned and creaked in the fog that perpetually shrouded the river, their hulls rotting in water that had become more sewer than waterway. The sound echoed through the night like the death rattles of dying giants, a constant reminder that even the mightiest constructions of human ambition were subject to decay and dissolution. Children who lived near the river learned to sleep through these sounds, but they never learned to ignore their meaning. That everything, eventually, succumbs to the inexorable pull of entropy. In the playgrounds that dotted the city's few green spaces, the bitter chill of fog rolled across empty swings and abandoned seesaws at dusk, transforming spaces meant for joy into landscapes of desolation. The eerie silence was broken only by the distant, hollow cries of children at play, sounds that seemed to come from another world, as if the ghosts of happier times were trying to communicate across an unbridgeable chasm of loss and suffering. Behind the shuttered windows of homes throughout the city, the muffled whispers of mourning mothers created a constant undertone of grief that permeated the very atmosphere. These were women who had learned to expect loss, who prepared for funerals as routinely as they prepared meals. Their whispered prayers and quiet sobs formed the soundtrack of a society that had normalized the death of its young, that had learned to measure success not by how many children survived, but by how efficiently the system could process their loss and move on to the next tragedy. This was the world that shaped J.M. Barrie's imagination, the crucible in which his dark vision of eternal childhood was forged. Every element of his story, from the lost boy's perpetual youth to Peter's casual attitude toward death, reflected the grim realities of a society that had made peace with the systematic destruction of innocence. The metallic tang of blood on cobblestone streets was not metaphor. It was the daily reality of children whose lives were cut short by industrial accidents, disease, and the simple brutality of a system that valued profit over human life. In this landscape of institutionalized suffering, the idea of a place where children never grew up would have carried a very different meaning than it does today. To the grieving mothers and traumatized survivors of Victorian London, eternal childhood was not a gift. It was the natural state of those who died too young to experience the fullness of human existence. Peter Pan's Neverland was not an escape from this reality. It was a reflection of it, a liminal space where the dead children of London could continue their half-existence, forever frozen at the moment of their greatest vulnerability. The criminal profile emerges not from flesh and bone, but from the systematic machinery of Victorian society itself, personified in the ethereal figure of Peter Pan. This entity operates with the calculated precision of institutional neglect, wearing the costume of childhood whimsy to mask its true function as an agent of selective termination. The angel of death manifests in worn velvet breeches the color of dried blood, a tunic that shifts between forest green and the mottled brown of decomposing leaves, and a cap adorned with a single raven's feather that catches no light. Its feet remain perpetually bare, leaving no prints yet somehow tracking the metallic tang of blood mixed with dust across cobblestone streets wherever it treads. The methodology employed by this entity follows the established patterns of Victorian child management systems, where inconvenient youth simply vanished into workhouses, orphanages, or unmarked graves. Peter Pan's recruitment process mirrors the clinical efficiency of these institutions, identifying targets through systematic observation of vulnerable populations. Children exhibiting signs of malnutrition, those displaying early symptoms of tuberculosis, evidenced by persistent coughing and pale complexion, or orphans whose guardians have recently perished, become primary candidates for collection. The entity approaches through established social channels, often appearing as a benefactor offering escape from immediate suffering, much like the false promises of factory owners seeking small hands for dangerous machinery. The costume serves multiple psychological functions beyond mere disguise. The green tunic evokes the uniform of charitable organizations that historically collected street children under the pretense of salvation, while the feathered cap mimics the headwear of traveling performers, who often served as covers for human trafficking operations. The bare feet represent the entity's claim to eternal childhood, while simultaneously marking it as outside civilized society, much like the barefoot urchins who roamed London's underbelly. This calculated presentation exploits the Victorian romanticization of childhood innocence, while operating within the very systems designed to exploit that innocence. The recruitment methodology demonstrates sophisticated understanding of child psychology and social vulnerability. The entity identifies targets during moments of maximum desperation, approaching children who have witnessed parental death, experienced abandonment, or suffered abuse within institutional care. The initial contact follows a predictable pattern. The appearance of magical elements during periods of extreme distress, offering immediate relief from hunger, cold, or fear. The entity presents Neverland not as a destination, but as an escape mechanism, exploiting the child's natural desire to flee unbearable circumstances. The transportation process reveals the clinical nature of the operation. Children are not physically relocated, but rather psychologically severed from reality through a combination of malnutrition-induced delirium and systematic isolation from adult supervision. The entity exploits the Victorian medical understanding of childhood diseases, particularly those affecting neurological function, to create a state of suspended animation that mimics magical transformation while actually representing progressive physical deterioration. The flying sensation described by victims correlates with the lightheadedness and dissociation common in advanced stages of tuberculosis or typhoid fever. Within the constructed environment of Neverland, the entity maintains control through carefully orchestrated deprivation disguised as adventure. The Lost Boys represent various stages of physical and psychological decline, with newer arrivals displaying relatively normal behavior, while long-term residents exhibit the hollow-eyed compliance of chronic malnutrition. The entity's thinning-out process follows established institutional protocols for managing overcrowding, selecting victims based on age, physical condition, and potential for resistance. Those who begin showing signs of sexual maturation or questioning the established order are systematically eliminated through methods that leave no traceable evidence. The psychological manipulation employed demonstrates intimate knowledge of childhood developmental stages and trauma responses. The entity exploits the natural tendency of abused children to idealize absent parents by positioning itself as the ultimate parental figure, simultaneously nurturing and terrifying. It creates artificial family structures among the Lost Boys that mirror the hierarchical systems of workhouses and orphanages, using peer pressure and competition to maintain order. The constant threat of abandonment or punishment keeps victims compliant, while the promise of eternal play masks the reality of forced labor and gradual physical deterioration. The forensic examination of this systematic destruction reveals a pattern of symptoms that medical professionals of the era would have recognized as common childhood ailments, making detection nearly impossible. The initial stages present as simple fatigue and loss of appetite, easily attributed to the stress of recent trauma or change in environment. Victims begin experiencing intermittent fever and night sweats, their skin taking on a waxy pallor that the entity explains as the natural result of avoiding sunlight in their magical realm. The acrid smoke from coal fires choking narrow Victorian alleys follows them even in their delirium, as their damaged respiratory systems struggle to process increasingly contaminated air. As the condition progresses, victims develop a persistent cough that produces blood-tinged sputum, though this symptom is carefully concealed from newer arrivals to maintain the illusion of health and vitality. The entity encourages victims to view these symptoms as signs of transformation rather than deterioration, explaining that the blood represents the shedding of their mortal nature. Their breathing becomes increasingly labored, particularly during periods of physical activity that the entity frames as games and adventures. The sour stench of overflowing sewage mixing with damp stone walls permeates their living spaces, creating ideal conditions for bacterial growth and respiratory infection. The neurological effects manifest as progressive cognitive decline, disguised as the natural simplicity of eternal childhood. Victims experience increasing difficulty with memory formation and retention, finding themselves unable to recall specific details of their previous lives or the exact duration of their stay in Neverland. The entity exploits this symptom by claiming that forgetting their past represents successful integration into their new existence. Concentration becomes increasingly difficult, with victims displaying shortened attention spans and difficulty following complex instructions, symptoms the entity attributes to the carefree nature of perpetual play. Physical deterioration accelerates as the condition enters advanced stages. Victims develop open sores that refuse to heal, particularly around the mouth and extremities, which the entity explains as battle wounds from their adventures with pirates and wild animals. The faint but constant drip of cold water in dark, cramped orphanage basements echoes in their ears as their auditory processing deteriorates, creating phantom sounds that the entity incorporates into elaborate fantasies about underground hideouts and secret passages. Their skin becomes increasingly thin and translucent, taking on a bluish tinge around the lips and fingernails that indicates severe oxygen deprivation. The final stages present with complete cardiovascular collapse, masked as the ultimate transformation into fairy-like beings. Victims experience severe chest pain and irregular heartbeat, symptoms the entity describes as their hearts learning to fly. The brittle rustle of brittle autumn leaves crushing underfoot in misty graveyards follows their movements as their joints become increasingly stiff and painful, their bones brittle from prolonged malnutrition and lack of sunlight. Their body temperature drops significantly, creating the clammy touch of cold, pale skin of a sick child fading from life. Though the entity maintains that this coolness represents their ethereal nature, respiratory distress reaches critical levels as victims struggle for each breath, their lungs filling with fluid that creates the eerie silence broken only by the distant, hollow cries of children at play echoing in their chest cavity. The entity presents this symptom as the development of gills for underwater adventures, encouraging victims to embrace the sensation of drowning as a new form of breathing. Their extremities begin showing signs of necrosis, with fingers and toes turning black and developing a sweet, sickly odor that the entity claims represents the scent of fairy dust. The psychological symptoms parallel the physical decline with devastating precision. Victims experience progressive dissociation from reality, finding themselves unable to distinguish between their current suffering and the elaborate fantasies constructed by the entity. The bitter chill of fog rolling over desolate playgrounds at dusk becomes their constant companion as their body temperature regulation fails, creating a perpetual state of hypothermia that the entity frames as the cool touch of magic. Their emotional responses become increasingly muted, displaying the flat affect common in severe depression and trauma-induced catatonia. The final psychological transformation involves complete acceptance of their fate, with victims displaying the peaceful compliance of terminal patients who have moved beyond fear into resignation. The muffled whispers of mourning mothers behind shuttered windows become the soundtrack of their existence as they lose the ability to cry out for help. Their vocal cords damaged by persistent coughing and their psychological capacity for resistance completely eroded. The entity presents this silence as the development of telepathic abilities, claiming that true fairies communicate without words. The creaking, groaning of ancient wooden ships lost in fog on the Thames provides the auditory backdrop for their final moments as their skeletal system begins to collapse under the weight of advanced osteoporosis and joint deterioration. The entity maintains the maritime fantasy until the end, describing their death as setting sail for new adventures beyond the second star to the right. The victims expire believing they are embarking on the ultimate journey, their compromised neurological function preventing them from recognizing the clinical reality of multiple organ failure and systemic collapse that characterizes their actual condition. The morning of May 15, 1878, dawned gray over the River Forth, its waters moving with the sluggish certainty of fate. David Barry, 13 years old, had risen early that Tuesday, his breath visible in the cold Scottish air as he made his way down to the frozen pond near his home on Brechin Road. The ice looked solid enough. It had held the neighborhood children for weeks. But ice, like childhood itself, is deceptive in its permanence. At precisely 9:47 a.m., according to the coroner's report, the ice gave way. David's body disappeared beneath the black water with barely a sound, swallowed by the hungry mouth of winter. His younger brother, James Matthew Barry, 6 years old, was still warm in his bed on Kirriemuir's cobbled streets when the news arrived like a death knell through their stone cottage. The boy who would become J.M. Barry learned that morning what every child eventually discovers: that the world devours its young without ceremony, without reason, without mercy. Margaret Ogilvy Barry, their mother, retreated into her grief like a wounded animal seeking darkness. She would spend the remaining years of her life attempting to resurrect David through James, dressing him in his dead brother's clothes, speaking to him as if he were the ghost made flesh. In the suffocating parlor of their Victorian home, surrounded by David's untouched belongings and the lingering scent of his soap, James learned to perform resurrection. He became a living memorial, a breathing gravestone, a child haunted by the specter of the boy he could never be. The transformation was complete by noon on that terrible day. James Matthew Barry ceased to exist as himself and became instead a hollow vessel for his mother's desperate love, a Peter Pan avant la lettre, a boy who would never truly grow up because growth meant betraying the dead. In the dim gaslight of their home on Bank Street, he practiced David's mannerisms, studied his brother's school papers, learned to laugh with a dead boy's voice. The performance would last a lifetime. By evening, as the lamplighters made their rounds through Kirriemuir's narrow streets, the mythology had begun. Margaret Ogilvy whispered to her surviving son about a place where children never died, where David still played in eternal sunshine, where the cruel arithmetic of mortality held no dominion. These were the first seeds of Neverland, planted in the fertile soil of a mother's madness and a child's survivor guilt. The fairy tale was born not from imagination, but from the desperate human need to transform unbearable reality into bearable fiction. The years that followed traced a map of psychological excavation. Young Barry wandered the moors around Kirriemuir, searching for the portal his mother had promised him, the secret entrance to the land where David waited. He found instead the harsh beauty of the Scottish landscape, where ancient stones marked forgotten graves and the wind carried the voices of the long dead. In the abandoned quarries and hidden glens, he began to populate an imaginary world with the lost children of his grief, boys who had escaped the terrible machinery of growing up by the simple expedient of dying young. London in the 1890s provided the perfect laboratory for these dark experiments in mythology. The city's East End teemed with orphaned children, their faces gaunt with hunger, their eyes already ancient with premature knowledge of suffering. They lived in the workhouses along Dorset Street and Thrall Street, in the shadow of Christ Church Spitalfields, where the fog rolled in from the Thames like a grey shroud. These were Barry's true lost boys, not the sanitized adventurers of his published tales, but the actual lost children of industrial England, discarded by a society that consumed its young with mechanical efficiency. In his rooms at 133 Gloucester Road, Barry began the alchemical process of transforming these real horrors into palatable fantasy. The notebooks from this period, their pages yellowed with age and stained with what might be tears or might be tea, reveal the methodical construction of a lie so beautiful that the world would embrace it as truth. Here, in cramped handwriting that grew smaller and more desperate with each page, he recorded his observations of the street children who disappeared with such regularity that their absence barely registered in the city's consciousness. The children of Whitechapel and Bethnal Green lived lives of such precarious brutality that death came as a mercy rather than a tragedy. They succumbed to consumption in the damp cellars beneath Commercial Street, to typhus in the overcrowded tenements of Flower and Dean Street, to simple starvation in doorways that offered no shelter from London's pitiless winter. Barrie walked among them like an anthropologist of despair, cataloging their brief existences, their flickering hopes, their inevitable extinctions. But the truth was too heavy to bear, too sharp to touch without bleeding. So he began the great work of transformation, spinning the raw material of childhood mortality into the gossamer threads of eternal youth. The lost boys of his imagination were not dying children, but adventurous spirits who had chosen never to grow up, who had found in Neverland a refuge from the disappointments of adulthood. The hook-handed captain who pursued them was not poverty or disease or neglect, but a theatrical villain who could be defeated by clever children armed with happy thoughts and fairy dust. The process took decades to complete. From the first tentative sketches in the 1890s through the triumphant stage production of 1904 to the definitive novel of 1911, Barrie refined his mythology with the patience of a master craftsman. Each revision moved further from the truth. Each draft more successfully buried the bodies upon which the fantasy was built. The real lost boys, the children who had died in London's slums, who had frozen in its doorways, who had simply vanished into the city's indifferent maw, became invisible. Their suffering transformed into entertainment for the very society that had destroyed them. Peter Pan himself emerged as the masterpiece of this dark artistry. Neither fully alive nor properly dead, he existed in the liminal space between being and non-being, a psychopomp who guided children not to adventure, but to a kind of beautiful stasis that looked remarkably like death. His eternal youth was not a gift, but a curse. Not freedom, but imprisonment. Not life, but a sophisticated form of dying that could be sustained indefinitely. He was the angel of death, wearing the mask of eternal childhood, and his domain was not Neverland, but the space between heartbeats, the pause between breaths, the moment when a child's laughter stops forever. The genius of Barrie's creation lay not in its originality, but in its perfect calibration to human psychological need. Faced with the unbearable reality of childhood mortality, society embraced a lie so complete, so seductive, that it became more real than truth. Parents who had buried their own children found comfort in the idea that somewhere, in a place beyond the reach of time and sorrow, their lost ones played forever in eternal sunshine. The fairy tale became a cultural narcotic, dulling the pain of reality until the pain itself was forgotten, leaving only the sweet ache of beautiful impossibility. This is the verdict that history must render, that Peter Pan is not a story about the triumph of imagination over reality, but about the triumph of denial over truth. It is not a celebration of childhood, but a monument to childhood's destruction. Not a fantasy of escape, but a prison constructed from the very chains it pretends to break. The boy who never grows up is not free. He is trapped in the amber of eternal immaturity, preserved forever at the moment of his destruction. A beautiful corpse, animated by the desperate love of those who cannot bear to let him die. We tell ourselves that fairy tales protect children from harsh realities, but the opposite is true. They protect adults from the harsh reality of what we do to children. They allow us to transform our guilt into nostalgia, our complicity into innocence, our failures into fantasies of redemption. We create these mythologies not for the children we claim to love, but for ourselves, to make bearable the unbearable knowledge that we are the ones who steal childhood. We are the ones who clip wings. We are the ones who feed the young to the machinery of civilization and call it progress. The warning embedded in this revelation cuts deeper than any fairy tale moral. Human nature contains within it a terrible capacity for self-deception, a willingness to construct elaborate mythologies to avoid confronting uncomfortable truths. We prefer beautiful lies to ugly realities, comforting fantasies to disturbing facts. But this preference comes at a cost that compounds across generations. By refusing to face the truth about childhood mortality, about social inequality, about our own complicity in systems that destroy innocence, we ensure that the destruction continues. The angel of death is not defeated by fairy tales. He is empowered by them, given new forms and faces that make his work more palatable, more acceptable, more easily ignored. Peter Pan does not save children from death. He makes their deaths more beautiful, more meaningful, more bearable for the adults who survive them. The story does not preserve childhood. It embalms it, turning living children into monuments to adult nostalgia and guilt. In the end, we are all complicit in this grand deception, all participants in the collective lie that transforms suffering into entertainment, mortality into mythology, death into a kind of twisted immortality. We clutch our fairy tales like talismans against the darkness, never realizing that the darkness has already won, that it has convinced us to mistake shadows for light, death for life, endings for beginnings. The boy who never grows up is not a symbol of eternal youth, but of eternal death, forever frozen at the moment of his destruction, forever beautiful, forever lost, forever ours to mourn and celebrate and ultimately forget. And in our forgetting, the cycle begins again, as it always has, as it always will, world without